really nice to be here and to have a chance to say something constructive about Christian marriage, particularly for the Church of England, because as you can see from the handout, I am going to range a little bit more widely than just Augustine. I can't help noticing that we've got a very strongly historical arrangement for all the speakers today, which I couldn't approve of more, so thank you for that. And I'm going to try and persuade you all that Augustine is not the enemy, and that if we try to understand marriage historically, we're going to get on considerably more productively than the Church does when it divorces its theology of marriage from the history of marriage. You need to have proper historical understanding, because there's nothing so dangerous as somebody else's principles that don't work in practice and have never been made to. So I just want to start. I expect you've probably done this already. I wasn't here for the beginning, but I want to flip up Genesis 2 because of the phrasing it uses. I've put it on your handout. I'm sure you all know it. A man leaves his father and mother and shall cleave unto his wife. I've used the authorised version deliberately. And they shall be one flesh. And that is what the Hebrew says. I've been careful about that. Now, when I put that next to what the modern church liturgy says about it, we've got two versions of the Common Worship Marriage Preface. And the first one, I have to say, I cannot bring myself to use. I was never more relieved than when I discovered you could go, I can't believe I'm saying this, you could go back to use the ASB instead, which was slightly more bearable. And there are lots of things that I think are good in the prefaces, both of them. But the one that really causes me some problems is the delight and tenderness of sexual union and joyful commitment to the end of their lives. Yeah, right is what my mind is always thinking while I'm listening to that. And it's partly a question of actual language, because playing with words is what I do, and trying to find exactly the right word to render another word is what I waste my life on. And the word sexual does not fit in that liturgical context. It sounds silly. And I did check with Charlotte first whether I could tell this story, and some of you may be left completely blank when I do, but when I was training for the priesthood at Westcott House, I can remember sitting in on a wedding in the church in Great Shelford, which is quite a posh parish on the edge of Cambridge, and it was quite a posh vicar taking the service. But the punters, the actual congregation, were not posh at all, au contraire. And they were all a bit mystified. It wasn't quite like when you've got the Romanis smoking at the back, during the baptism, but it was almost like that. And they'd obviously got no idea what was going on through most of this liturgy. And the couple, not surprisingly, had chosen for one of the hymns, All Things Bright and Beautiful. You wouldn't think there was a problem with that, except that they put down all the verses. And I was sitting behind a group of sort of shaven-headed, tattooed chaps. And when we got to the purple-headed mountain, that was absolutely it as far as they were concerned. They'd lost it for the rest of the service. They were absolutely wetting themselves laughing. And of course, so was I, because I knew what they were laughing about. And it was one of those things where you think, yes, but it doesn't really mean that. It's like when children learning German discover that the German word for grandfather is Großvater. It's absolutely hilarious for about 5 minutes. And the purple-headed mountain was not a good fit in the sort of solemnity of holy matrimony. So finding the right word is important. I think sexual union and joyful commitment is not really how most people encounter their bodily union in marriage. So I think probably the joy of the bodily union is a better alternative. And I will say a bit more in a minute about why I think Adam knew Eve is a really good and important way of translating what sexual intercourse has to say in the context of marriage in general. But I'm going to go even further forward out of my remit into modern criminal law. And this is partly because I've got a husband who's a professor of English private law at Cambridge and also teaches criminal law in the university. And you don't need to read the whole of the statute, but the point that's really interesting is that English law is in a transition stage in its understanding of marriage, and of course it's always out of kilter with the church. But the bit that's interesting here is that although in English civil law husband and wife can be treated as separate parties, there are certain conditions in English criminal law where they cannot, and one of them is conspiracy. It is not possible for a husband and wife to conspire because the law treats them as one flesh. That's why the one flesh bit is important. They cannot conspire with one another. If a husband and wife, let's say Graham and I, my husband, decide to conspire with Charlotte about something. if we get caught by the police and they have to charge us, they would have to charge Charlotte and me with conspiracy, and my husband Graham and Charlotte with conspiracy, but they couldn't charge the three of us because Graham and I are one flesh. So, there are very interesting overhangs about how that's dealt with. And in fact, when civil partnerships came along, there was a perfect chance for the government to do the sensible thing and change the legislation to say, of course, husband and wife are separate people. But they didn't. They said civil partnerships had the same privilege. So if you're in a civil partnership, you cannot conspire with one another either, which I thought was...
You're one flesh.
Because you're one flesh, which is making a very odd assumption. The government has got real problems about one flesh, which I'll come on to just towards the end. It's going to be gloves off here, not for the squeamish. But let's get on to Augustine. I've given you on the handout some references to Augustine, which you may want to skim through or look at me and listen to me and then look at those later. It doesn't really matter. But what you need to know when you're thinking about Augustine, there he is, a bishop in the late 4th, early 5th centuries. He's not just a theologian. He has a very bad reputation because he struggled properly to define things as intelligently as he could in his own time. And of course, his definitions are out of date. That's not his fault. Historically, it's ludicrous to blame him for not being us. But the point is that he's not just a theologian, somebody who thinks theoretically about these things. From a historical point of view, he's somebody who understood what sex was like. A lot of the church fathers, oh no, they couldn't possibly, and they preserved their virginity and then told everyone else how to live. Not Augustine. He did actually try out sex and child rearing and all the rest of it. So I think that makes him an important person to listen to. Now, if you want to see his full-blown thinking on marriage, he wrote a short treatise on the good of marriage, and I've given you references to it, around the turn of the century. But the best short summary is in the literal commentary on Genesis, and I think it's really, in its way, very appealing. He says marriage is threefold. You'd expect him to do that because he's always looking for interesting numbers. That it consists of faithfulness, offspring, and sacrament. And I'll just read through this as you absorb it. As to faithfulness, it entails no sleeping with another man or woman outside the bond of marriage. As to offspring, it requires that they be lovingly received, kindly nurtured, devoutly raised. As to the sacrament, it means no dividing of the marriage. In the case of divorce, that neither husband nor wife be remarried to someone else, even for the sake of offspring. And that's a really key exception, because in the ancient world it was common that you could divorce, male or female could institute divorce on the grounds of childlessness and look somewhere else, because offspring were really important. But Augustine says no. The rule of marriage either regulates our natural fruitfulness or curbs our immoral lack of self-control. And he goes on to say, I've said plenty about this elsewhere, and I don't want to say any more. So that's the theological summary. What about the underlying attitude? And I've given you this, I think it's on page 2. I want us to try and think seriously about marriage, not just as a theoretical concept, but as something that people actually live out. So you've got to, this is very much in my mind at the moment, because I've just been fiddling about with the translation and notes for my book, a snip at 15.99 when it comes out. These Augustine and his friends have finally realised that they've got to live the good life, and how are they going to do it? And Confessions 6:14, here is their cunning example. This is picking up what we heard in the first talk, that they would decide the right way to do it. Let's go and be monks, because they've read the life of St. Anthony. God, that's good, this is where we're going to do it. This is the way to be a proper believer. So many of us who were friends, he says, had animated discussions and debates. And we so disliked the tempestuous tribulations of human life that we'd almost made up our minds to live a life of peace in some deserted place. We would strive to build up that peace by holding in common whatever we owned, thus forging out of it all a single family unit. You can see how he's adopting the monastic model and also picking up aspects of the biblical suggestions. But next, we started to consider whether the little wives would allow it. For some of us were already married, and others of us also wanted wives. So the entire plan, which we constructed so perfectly, broke apart in our hands, shattered, and was abandoned. So, all for the sake of the little wives. And he uses this really irritating word, mulierculae. Mulier is a woman in Latin. Muliercula is a little woman. It couldn't be more patronising. It makes me think of Map and Lucia, and do you remember the Scottish parson who's always talking about his wee wifey? Well, I think wee wifey is the perfect translation for mulierculae. So it's a very, very patronising word. It's not Augustine at his best, but this is him, I think, really struggling with how to do things right with his concubine. Concubine, if you take it to bits, means somebody you share your bed with, and it was a legal status in the Roman world. It was recognised even within certain aspects of Christianity. And he says that that woman, we don't know what her name is because he never tells us. He only tells us in Confessions the names of people who helped his progress to Christianity. So anybody who didn't help doesn't get a name. And he never tells us who she is, but they spent many years together. That woman with whom I used to share my bed was torn from my side. Notice how he uses a passive there to imply that it wasn't his decision. I mean, his mother had a lot to do with all of this, and I personally think had a lot to answer for. But he feels that he was made to do this, and to some extent that's true. She was taken away on the grounds that she stood in the way of my marriage, and this is legally true as well as sort of emotionally true. Since the time of Constantine, it was not legal in Roman law to have a wife and a concubine. That's how recognised the status of concubine was. I'll come on to that in a bit. So she stood in the way of my marriage. My heart, which was so attached to her, was broken and pierced, leaving a trail of blood. She returned to Africa, vowing to you that she would never have, and that's that biblical kind of have, another man. She left behind with me my son, that's Adeodatus, which is an interesting name for a non-Christian at the time to choose. He was given by God. My son she had born to me. Sorry, that's a typo there. That's the wrong... I've got to change that verb, it's not right. I was wretched. I could not follow even a woman's example. He says he means by restraining from having sexual intercourse again. I was impatient with delay. There were still 2 years to go before I took the wife I had chosen. That's because she's underage. And as I was not a lover of marriage but a slave of lust, I chose another woman, we don't know her name either, but not to be my wife. Thus the disease of my soul, so he makes that connection really clearly and simply between what he's doing physically with his body and the effect it's having on his soul. That disease remained as great or even greater as this liaison sustained and prolonged it. And I was in subjection to a habit which could persist into the realm of matrimony. He understands that, however, we might process it differently, but we also understand in our modern world that sex can be an addiction and that pornography can be problematic for people. Augustine cannot cope with his sexual urges, and whatever understanding we have of that, I think we still have to recognise that it's that with his self-perception and self-awareness, he's realised he's actually got a serious psychological problem that he's dealing with. And the wound that was inflicted was not healed. Instead, or even though he's got this other woman in his bed, after the passion and bitter grief of parting, it began to fester. More chill and lonely than ever was its anguish. So you can't really read that and not take seriously the fact that Augustine knew what love, what physical affection and emotional love were really all about. He honestly did. He understood the good of marriage where affection and friendship and physical joining of two people in the knowing of one another is concerned. But this woman has not of sufficient social status to marry him. That's the problem. Now, we may think that that's ridiculous, that you can't marry across class divides. In fact, I'm sure we do think it's ridiculous, except when you look around you and you think about how many people marry out of their own class or social context. The most obvious example I would have thought would be Kate Middleton becoming the future Queen of England. That's a pretty big jump, but it's only noticeable because most people do not marry outside their own social group. We look for people with whom we feel comfortable. And in fact, what that's stating, that legal restriction, is, in the ancient world, in their terms, is something that we also think in our world is true, which is that husband and wife should be equal partners in a marriage. Now, they construe that equality differently from us. But the fact that you need to be equal partners, that you need to be on some kind of level with one another, it shouldn't be a dependency relationship, that they do understand. They just express it differently. So Augustine has got various things in the way of his fulfilment in marriage. One of them is the social and legal restrictions that I've just mentioned, and the other one is the one that we've already touched on, the negative Christian attitudes to sexual intercourse. I think we have to understand that we are the oddities here. It's only in the last 30 or 40 years that people have started to think that continence, which we now have a different kind of echo in, but continence, self-control, self-abstention from sexual intercourse is a self-evident good. You know, it was a self-evident good in every era except our own that self-restraint was a good thing, and it was self-evident for Augustine as well. He thought it was obvious. So that is a shift which has happened in our own time, the causes of which seem to me to be completely obvious. and straightforward, contraception basically, and the legalisation of abortion. And without those two factors, the kind of freedom which comes to women has not been possible, and nor has the disconnect between sexual intercourse and procreation of children. It makes such a big shift in our theological thinking that we're only beginning to process it, and most people won't talk about it at all. So let's get on to Roman attitudes to marriage a bit. I'm very keen on us understanding this from a sociological and anthropological point of view. So whether that's to do with people as groups, sociology, or people as individuals, anthropology. And that's not a very clear divide, but the point is that marriage is a social construct. It regulates and it restricts and it defines boundaries and it clarifies legal status. And, of course, in a pre-DNA area, again, every era except our own, it's a control mechanism for securing a legitimate offspring. Knowing that your progeny are your progeny. How do you do that?
If you're a man. If you're a man.
If you're a man, it's not a problem for women. Unless they're having lots and lots of partners at the same time. They know who the father of their child is, but no man ever knows unless he's got sufficiently restrictive control over the freedom of action of his women. His, in the sense that in the Roman world, if you're a pater familias, the head of the household, nobody could do anything without your legal fiat. So to understand marriage as an idea, what Christians would call theologically, we have to look at it in a social context. Because marriage, as I'm sure you've already heard, is not always the same everywhere. It depends on social circumstances and it's shaped by the society in which it finds itself. There are three famous laws which were passed by the first serious Roman emperor, Augustus, which give you a pretty quick insight into how the Romans felt about marriage. The first one is the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus, that's 18 BC, and that was the one that limited marriage across social classes. Augustus, the emperor, was worried about people marrying across class boundaries. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coercendis, that was a year later, punished people for adultery. It became a criminal offence to commit adultery. Think about what that might say about how you understand your society. And then thirdly, much later in 9 AD, the Lex Papia Poppaea was a series of incentives to produce offspring within lawful marriage. So there was a kind of social anxiety about getting legal offspring. Now, people argue a lot about what the subtext of those laws was. But I think the best piece of work that's been done on it still is by a man called Wallace Hadrill, who argues that all these laws that were passed, and which were still effective in Augustine's time to some extent, I'm not an expert on Roman law, their underlying aim was to stabilise the property regime of the Roman elite. Lived in a world where it was actually more advantageous to be childless, because then, according to the social setup, you got courted by people so that you could leave your money to them. Well, Augustus doesn't want that to happen. He doesn't want money and property left outside the family. So he stops it happening by making sure that everybody gets legal offspring. So he wants to stabilise property. He wants to stabilise the production of legitimate heirs. And this way he perpetuates status boundaries, which to us doesn't sound like a self-evident good, but to him it is. It means stable society, which is what Roman law is all about. That's what they're aiming at, and that's what marriage does in society. It stabilises it. If you look at another book by John Whitton, I know I've given you the reference somewhere there. In Augustine's time, what was marriage? Just the summary here. It's a union of a man and a woman, a life partnership involving divine and human law, voluntarily contracted for the sake of affection and procreation. Those are the two things. The point I'm trying to make here is that affection is always recognised as a legitimate reason for marriage. And as far as the issue of consent goes, you could not marry prepubescent because you weren't capable of doing what marriage was about, in other words, procreating. You couldn't marry if you were a slave because you weren't legally a human person, and so couldn't legally give the kind of consent that was required. So when we look at marriage in that kind of context, we come back to Augustine, my chap, in the 4th to 5th centuries, and we think about affection, procreation and sacrament. They are a means to the end of a stable society. Now, for the couple, this is not true. Nobody marries in order to secure a stable society. They marry for affection, procreation and sacrament. Augustine did later work out that God had a further purpose in legitimating marriage, which was to fill up the number of the elect. But that takes us into the realm of predestination, on which I'm neither an expert nor remotely interested, so you have to work that one out yourselves. But that was, for him, a further purpose of marriage. And I'm going to turn now to a little bit of On the Good of Marriage, and I think I've put down somewhere on this handout a warning for you. Did I leave it here? Yes, it's the bottom of the third page. I'm just going to read it out for you because I think this is very funny. This is from the post-Nicene Fathers, the series of those enormous volumes that we all made to read at Theological College on the Fathers. This is the Reverend C.L. Cornish, who translated On the Good of Marriage. The editors, he says, are aware of the danger there is in reading a treatise like this, like the following, in a spirit of idle curiosity. I hope nobody's idly curious here. And they beg any reader who has not well assured himself, obviously, that his aim is right and holy to abstain from perusing. So this is dangerous stuff we're dealing with here. You've got to be very careful. Okay, so things that you might want to notice. For Augustine, sexual intercourse is not essential to marriage. Neither is it, I might add, in English law. It is perfectly legitimate to have a marriage which does not include consummation by physical joining in sexual intercourse, except that's only permissible if both parties consent to it. If either party expects the other to consummate the marriage and it doesn't happen, that is legitimate grounds for dissolving the marriage, not for dissolving it, but for declaring it null and void. And that's another thing that we have to come on to when we think about same-sex unions at the end. So he says in either sex there might exist, even without intercourse, a friendly and equal union. Now, the business of society, I think, is Augustine at its best. We must ask why it's a good, and it's not just the procreation of children, he says, but because of that very even natural society between the two sexes. And this you might be sort of uneasy about what he's saying here, and if we apply it straightforwardly to the modern world, perhaps it is. But what he's saying is really that men and women are capable of having intellectual society with one another, which was not something that everybody at the time really understood or accepted. So, let's be positive about the good things that he says, and that's certainly one of them. And again, this is picking up 1 Corinthians chapter 7 again. Married people owe something to one another. They owe each other an equal debt. And that's, obviously that's a metaphor. He's talking about it as a monetary exchange, which of course in the ancient world it almost always did include an element of money, and it did in the days of Jane Austen. A single man in possession of a good fortune is one of the key things. And most people in the modern world don't marry without giving some thought to property and finance. To be a real marriage, it's got to be exclusive and until death. And if you think exclusive is a given, I have heard of a couple who went to a Christian priest I know and said, we want to get married, but can we leave out that bit about keeping you only unto each other? Because, they didn't go into the because, but they just wanted to leave that clause out. They'd obviously had a conversation and thought, let's have an open marriage, but sorry, the Church of England doesn't recognise open marriage as marriage. You can't leave that clause out, and Augustine expected exclusivity. If you looked up section 9 of On the Good of Marriage, you'd find that it's talking about restraint versus sexual intercourse. And he says that some goods, like health, we seek for its own sake. Health is a good thing, we know that, we look for it because it's a good thing in itself. And others are for the sake of something else, like when we learn, we want to gain wisdom. And when we have sexual intercourse, it's for the procreation of people to engage in friendly society. Well, not sure it was ever on my mind. You have to speak for yourselves. But it's one reason he understands is he's trying to find positives is the point. Because he's living in a world where most people, most Christians and many Gnostics think that sex is disgusting because it's dirty and earthy, and the whole point of believing in God is to be taken away from all that nasty physical stuff. And he's saying, no, you can't do that, you have to take the physical seriously. Even to the extent that you cannot dissolve a marriage if the wife is, it's always the wife obviously, is barren. So procreation is not the be-all and end-all. And when he goes back later to the three goods of marriage, procreation, fidelity and sacrament, he points out that the procreation of children and fidelity are true for what he calls omnes gentes atque omnes homines, all nations and all peoples. But the third, the sacrament one, is only pertinent to the people of God. And then we get on to the very end where he shows the strongest foundation on which he privileges chastity. He says, I am speaking of what matters to the actual holy integrity of flesh. For who does not know what other merits Mary possesses? And this is where you come against the great difficulty that was not Augustine's fault, because he didn't write the canon of Holy Scripture. The perpetual virginity of Mary, which was taken as a given in those days, or by that time, and the negative things that Paul had to say, which we've heard earlier, comes by the 4th, 5th centuries to develop into a full corroboration for the idea that sexual intercourse is only good when you do it in God's way, and it's not even terribly good then. Possibly. So Augustine, in his day, recognised that affection was not just important in marriage, he thought it was essential, but he also expects that children are going to result. And he thinks, if you think about what he's actually aiming for in everything that he writes, he's trying to bring human sexual activity under control, because in the ancient world people thought it was dangerous. It does damage. And we might not want to talk about it in those terms these days, but we have plenty of issues of our own about teenage pregnancy and, as I said, really serious issues like internet pornography and addiction to it and all the rest of it. We haven't brought it under control, and some people would say we shouldn't even be trying. But if you don't find some way of stabilising what is a fundamental part of our humanness, you're going to have to deal with the consequences. That's really why I put these two inscriptions on page 3 of your handout. That I wasn't going to talk about them, but just to say a quick word. Sometimes people think that in the ancient world people just got married because of the laws and restrictions and the procreation of children and the money, and didn't take the affection seriously. And if you read this lovely 2nd century BC inscription, you realise that this is the grave inscription of a Roman wife and mother. So it was put up by the husband, and this is what the husband loves about his wife. You couldn't read this and not take it seriously. And if only for no other reason, and then the same reason we know in our own world when we read inscriptions like this, they cost money. It costs a lot of money to put a stone up, it costs a lot of money to chisel the letters in, and we pay by the letter. So putting that much stuff up about your wife means you really loved her. This is not just about money and kids. And the same is true on the next one, which I couldn't find a picture of the first one, but this picture here for Aurelia, who's a freed woman, and she's put one up about her husband. And she says at the age of 40 years, I'm stronger than death, and she's talking about him. So I just thought those were rather lovely and that you might like to look at them and reflect. So
I love, he flourished in the eyes of all due to my constant
dutifulness. Yes. So, yes, I might say that about my husband one day. So, I'd like to think so. He might argue. I'm always so glad when he's not here when I do things like this. It's the same that's true when I'm preaching at weddings as well. I always tell people I'm telling you the theory, and luckily my husband's not here to tell you what I'm like at home in terms of the practice. So here we've got the Augustine background, the sort of legal and social background of marriage as a social institution. It has effects on society, it has benefits for society. Now, when we think about marriage in the modern world, we're almost certainly thinking much more about personal things, about the couple, the expression of their feelings for one another. And the church sort of chisels in that bit about enriching society and it goes straight over people's heads. And we do have problems about marriage, and one is this personal fulfilment view, which obscures practicalities of getting married, and the other one is theological. And if we're going to make the case for gay marriage, and people will have different views about this, but if we're going to make that case, the problem we have is that we have to engage with those who are opposed on the grounds of Scripture and church history, because Scripture and church history are the strong ground from which the acceptance of same-sex partnerships and marriages are going to be founded. So if you look at Scripture, hierarchy within marriage, male-female is the only paradigm, rejection of all forms of homosexual sexual expression with or without marriage, that's the norm. That's what everybody saw as the norm, including Augustine. And we have to ask on what legitimate, theological but also historical grounds we might be able to think again. We've got two main things to put against this. How much longer have I got? 5 minutes?
5 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, I'll talk faster. Two things to put against it. One is the change in public attitudes over the last 50 years. I tend to think of this as Dot Cotton and the bed sheets. Does anybody know what I'm on about?
No.
It's in EastEnders, the first gay couple in EastEnders. And the moment when the penny dropped for Dot Cotton at the laundrette was when Barry, who was the younger partner in the relationship, came in asking if he could have his sheets done that day and could he pick them up in the evening because they'd only got one set of sheets. And until that point, Dot Cotton had not realised that they were sharing a bed. So that's the change in public attitudes. That's how I remember that one. On public opinion, it's exactly the same on this as it is on women bishops. Can't see what all the fuss is about. But that's not an argument. And if we're going to make the case, we have to have arguments as well as prejudices to carry the day. So the second thing, the other thing that we've got to put into the mix is the language. And this is how I usually hear it. You might find particular different adjectives, but these are the three that tend to stand out when I'm listening to people talk about it. Stable, faithful and loving relationships. That is the model. Not Augustine's fidelity, procreation, sacrament, but stable, faithful and loving relationships. Those are the powerful words in the defence vocabulary of those who are pro same-gender marriage. But stable and loving are not biblical words associated with marriage, not biblical ideals that are in marriage. The stable one, I think, is particularly interesting because it connects up with what Wallace Hadrill said about marriage as a force for stabilising society and stabilising property transmission and so on. Now, the Augustine's threefold definition, I think for most of the church's existence has been self-evident. We've just taken it for granted that those are the good things. But to swap faithfulness, procreation and sacrament for stable, faithful and loving is not unproblematic. The two paradigms are so far apart that we've got to explain how we get from one to the other and why the one that we're at the moment, if we're at it, is acceptable historically. So what would Augustine have made of it? I don't think he would have cared what the world said about marriage. He would have been much more interested in setting aside this touchy-feely, carey-sharey language and talking about what marriage actually is. Not just the friendship, not just the closeness, but the sexual expression of that friendship. That is a key for him. He didn't feel able to construe the Bible as allowing gay love sexually expressed. That's obvious. And, he couldn't find a way around Romans 1. He didn't have a reason to. In his culture and context, that wasn't relevant. And we're in a position where we do have to engage with that if we want the world to listen to us. We live in a world where male and female are relatively equal, at least in the developed society we live in, and where the stigma of divorce has been substantially reduced. And we can see a pattern emerging about shifting understandings of marriage, but we're not at the point yet where we can say that a marriage which doesn't include the begetting of children as a fundamental aspect of it, because that's inherently connected to the need for sexual intercourse to take place for the marriage to be legitimate, unless both parties consent otherwise, that is a fundamental part of marriage. It's not a necessary part, but it is a fundamental part. And I think that's where most people are struggling when they try to equate same-gender unions with hetero unions. And the problem that we've really got, and I'll just finish with this, sorry, really fast, is that we're too squeamish about talking about sex in marriage, sexual intercourse. The government doesn't want to talk about it. It has not either made or defined sexual intercourse as a fundamental part of gay marriage legislation. You can annul a hetero marriage on the grounds of non-consummation if somebody's unhappy with that. You can't do it for a same-gender union. Why? Obviously because nobody in the government wants to define what counts as consummation in gay marriage. And frankly, who can blame them? But the point that this actually focuses us in on is right back to Genesis, and Adam knew Eve. The act of having sexual intercourse with someone is an act of knowing. And as long as the church is full of people who are pretending that nobody has sex outside marriage and is run by people who are, I count as young in the church and I'm 49 years old, who, the struggles of teenage years and how to manage a sexual urge that arrives in your early teens when you don't marry until you're 30. We just don't talk about it. And we're not prepared to face it, and therefore, we can't be honest about the kind of parameters within which we discuss the problem. The fact of biblically knowing one another is a binding factor in a relationship and its stability. We know this through experience. And can it be a marriage without it? Yes, it can legally, but it is problematic in a sense. So I would say, from a historical point of view, not a theological, because actually really I'm not a theologian, I'm a historian. I never was much good at theology. The question isn't, if we look at ourselves as part of society here, I'm just saying not just as the church gathered and separated, the question isn't if gay marriage, it's when gay marriage and how gay marriage. And the challenge for us as theologians and historians and as Christians is how to make sense of that intellectually and how to deal with it with integrity. Thank you.
Thank you.